Hey guys, it's Ian from Badass Rocketry, and today we're going to take a look at Mach 1's Thunderbird. Let's go to the build. Let's take a look at what's in the Thunderbird kit and most Mach 1 single fin kits. First, we have the decals. Buy the decals, they really do make the final product look better. Then there is the airframe, a set of fins, a motor mount tube centering rings, rail buttons, a shock cord tether, a metal tip nose cone, coupler for the nose cone shoulder, bulkhead for the coupler, and some hardware to attach a shock cord to the nose cone. Before you do anything with this kit, wash all the fiberglass with a degreasing agent. Sand the outside of the motor tube, both sides of the centering rings, inside the nose cone, the section of the coupler that will fit inside the nose cone, and the bulkheads. Also, sand inside the body tube with something very abrasive. In my case, I used a diamond file. You can see the score marks through the fiberglass. For the fins, I first did a normal sand along the fin tab with my sandpaper. Then I took a diamond file and used that on the tab. So after everything is sanded, I moved on to drilling some holes. You will need to drill a 1/4 inch hole into the center of the bulkhead for the nose cone. Then it is time for the fins. I stacked the fins on top of each other and taped them together. I then drilled small holes along the fin root. If you do this, don't drill them too close together. If you space them out a little, you will end up creating epoxy rivets once they are set in the airframe. This step is easy to do and adds a lot of strength to your fins, so I highly recommend it. The last thing I did for prep was to put another notch into the centering ring for the shock cord tether. This is not required, but the effort is small with a Dremel tool. And I like the peace of mind of having 2 attachment points instead of 1 for the tether. Alright, before we move on, we're going to talk about how to attach your fins to this particular airframe. We're going to do fin pockets in that build video, so stay tuned to watch that. But if you want the more classic way, where you actually pour your internal fillets from the aft end, you can do that. There are many how-tos on the internet on how to get this done, but just for a quick review for those of you who don't know how to do that, you're going to take that motor mount tube and you're going to epoxy the forward centering ring on that motor mount tube, and then you're going to slide that motor mount tube into the airframe with epoxy to epoxy it in place. While it sets, you want to make sure that you keep the aft centering ring on, but after it's done setting, you're going to want to remove the aft centering ring so that you have the aft end exposed. Then you're going to set each fin, and each fin you're going to put in 4 different fillets. You're going to do 2 at the bottom near the motor tube and 2 at the top near the airframe. And that's going to make sure that your fins stay in and they're strong and they're not going to go anywhere. For this build, like I said, we're going to do fin pockets. Fin pockets are actually my favorite way to do rockets, especially if they're smaller like this. I think that they're the fastest, easiest, cleanest way to get your fins onto your rocket, and it's also the strongest in my opinion. Just a couple things for you to think about when you're doing this. You can't do fin pockets for every rocket. If the motor tube is small compared to the airframe, you don't want to do fin pockets. That's because fin pockets do add a little bit extra weight to the aft end of your rocket. Now for this kit, I did the sims and my fin pockets only stole about 100 to 200 feet of altitude, which for this rocket is nothing. You guys will see that later on in the build once I get into the review. But that's just a few considerations for fin pockets. So if you've never seen fin pockets, check out the build. For those of you who have, check out the build. The first thing you are going to do is attach your centering rings forward and aft to the motor tube and epoxy them in place. I first marked where they need to be on the outside of the motor tube. I did this by holding the motor tube flush with the aft of the airframe and against the inner wall of the fin slot. Then I used a pencil to mark where the leading and trailing edges of the fin slot are on the motor tube. One thing that can happen is that your centering rings may not be square against the motor tube. To ensure this doesn't happen, I made sure that line extended all the way around that motor tube. From there, I slid on the rings and kept them in place with some tape on both sides. This allows me to slide the whole assembly in and out of the airframe to ensure everything lines up. Once I was happy with the way everything looked, I epoxied each ring into place one at a time. In this case, I did the forward ring first. As you can see, I made sure to slide the tether in the ring before I did any of this. After that was cured, I did the aftering. This kit is cut so the aftering is placed up against the motor retainer. So I took the time to JB weld the retainer and the aftering into place all at once and put that aside to cure. After that was done, it was time to create the dams for the fin pockets. First, you'll want to slide the motor mount into the airframe and use something to mark where each fin will go. I like using a mechanical pencil for this step. Then what you're going to do is dam each side of that line. What you're going to do is make a contained pocket of epoxy where each fin will go. You can use anything really. In the past, I've used cardboard, balsa, and even masking tape for BT60 kit. These dams are not meant to be used for anything other than containment of that epoxy. They are not structural. Small gaps are fine, and I attach them with super glue because it sets fast. Before I went further, I slid the motor mount into the airframe to ensure the pockets lined up. If they don't, you can reposition them. What you see here is probably the widest I'd ever go on this kit. I don't have a magic formula for this, I just go with gut feel. If you do this method and have some sort of formula or tip, please let me know. The last thing I needed to do for the motor mount was epoxy the two ends of the tether down. Normally I would tie a knot with each end, but the clearance from the motor mount to the airframe does not allow that. And honestly, for this small of a rocket, it's not required. After the motor mount was cured, it was time to slide it into the airframe, adding epoxy along the way. I like to tape up the fin slots when I do this because all epoxy is contained inside the airframe. Once it is in, you can stand it up and let it cure. You can also add some epoxy to the aft end of the airframe after this is cured, but I didn't, as the pockets will make sure that motor mount is going nowhere. Now it's time for the magic to happen. I love this method because of how fast, easy, and clean it is. First, tape off all around your fin slots. Make sure there is no airframe visible and the slot is not obstructed. Once that is done, mix up your favorite epoxy. I much prefer thicker epoxy for this as it will not seep through the cracks and run everywhere. Now pour the epoxy into the slot. If the slot is thin, like this 1/16 inch slot is, you'll have to pour a little at a time and make many passes with a popsicle stick to get it all in there. It may look like this is time consuming, but really, things move pretty quickly. You want to pour in enough epoxy to fill the slot when the fin is set inside. How do you know if you have enough? First, remove all the tape around the slot and insert your fin. If you can see the epoxy being pressed up against the airframe, you have enough. If it is seeping out of the top of the airframe through the fin slots, you have too much. But that's not a bad thing, just clean it up and move on. If you don't have enough, no problem. Remove the fin, tape up the slot, and add more. Do this for all your fins on the rocket. Once they are all set, you'll want to hold them in place while they cure. Do this with your Badass Build Guide. If you don't have a Badass Build Guide, go to badassrocketry.com to get one, or use whatever method you find useful. And that's it. The whole step from taping things off to setting the fins took me 30 minutes. Now the fins will have epoxy anchors, and the drilled holes make the epoxy rivets. Nothing is going to pull those fins out of the airframe. From here on out, you'll build this kit like any other rocket. Your external fillets can be really small because they're not going to be adding much to the integrity of the fins compared to the pockets. But let me remind you, take your time, be deliberate, and be smooth. Anything you can do to shape your fillets when you make them now is time and effort saved when you go to sanding. Good fillets take time, but your project is worth it. For the nose cone, you'll need to epoxy a few things together. First, I put the hardware on the bulkhead so the eye bolt is secure. Then I put epoxy around the inside of the coupler tube. Then I brought the bulkhead forward to create a fillet with the epoxy and the coupler. To let everything cure, I put 2 popsicle sticks on the coupler and rested the eye bolt on them. This is just one method to accomplish this task. I'm sure you have others, as do I. The last thing to do with the nose cone is to epoxy this coupler into the base of the nose cone, and then the nose cone is done. The very last thing for this kit was to drill 3 holes and screw in 2 rail buttons. I put the buttons at the aft centering ring and 22 inches from the nose. I made sure everything was in line with the badass build guide. The forward button is at the center of gravity for an average motor I'll fly in this rocket. The last hole was near the top and is a vent hole, as this particular rocket can get quite a bit of altitude. And that is it. Easy. The Thunderbird is done and ready for paint. All right, I hope you like that build video. Let's talk a little bit about this kit before we're done. First of all, who is this for? You can fly some G motors on this rocket, but it's really an L1 rocket. For those of you that have your level 1 certification, you can put any motor in here and you're going to succeed. For everybody else, if you're not level 1 certified yet and you want to become level 1 certified and you're looking at that really cool rocket that's a minimum diameter, everybody's going to steer you away and they're going to say low and slow, and they're going to ask you to look at getting some 4-inch cardboard. And that's great. That's how I certified. But if you want to have a lot of performance out of your L1 rocket, this is a great setup for it. And the reason why is you can put your baby H motor into this thing and you can fly it. It's only going to go about 2,000 to 2,400 feet, and then it's going to come down and you're going to succeed with your L1 certification. The goal with your L1 certification is to pass your L1 certification, not impress people. However, now that you're level 1 certified with this rocket, you can go and get a CTI 216 motor. You can shove that baby in here and you can send this up 10,000 feet and you'll probably break the sound barrier at the same time, which is pretty impressive for this particular through wall build. For everybody else, if you're level 2, you can go ahead and put a baby J motor in here. Something to think about when you start putting these larger motors in is that you're going to start running out of space in your airframe for your parachute. You're going to need at least a 36-inch parachute if it's a flat parachute. And I put 16 feet of Mach Kevlar cord. I did, I think, the 1,500-pound Kevlar cord. When you do that, you're also going to want to have maybe like a Jolly Logic chute release so that this can come down and you're not going to go walking for miles, because 10,000 feet is quite high. That's going to actually cause all this space here to be used up pretty quickly. And you're going to have to really push your nose cone on there, and you'll succeed, but you're going to have to push it on there really good. So what I did is I actually put in here 2 holes for my shear pins to keep the nose cone on. And then up in the top, I have an altimeter, and the altimeter is going to pop the nose cone off when I get to apogee. So that's going to ensure that the nose cone comes off. You're going to need that nose cone altimeter anyway, because once you start getting into those higher altitudes, the delays on those motors that you're purchasing are just not going to be enough for this particular rocket. So that's it. That's what you have here. You have the Mach 1 Thunderbird, a perfect L1 setup for those of you who want performance but also want to make sure you succeed. And then everybody else, this just performs really well on relatively small motors, and you're going to get some great flights and performance out of this kit. So I want you guys to go check out this rocket. Thanks for watching the video, and remember, badass starts with the build.